Hey, everybody. Welcome to Latter-day Struggles 2.0. No, this is 1.0. Oh, this is a Monday series. We have been working hard today. So happy to have you all here today. We are in episode 6. I've been saying of a many-part series because I haven't been willing to commit, but we're ready to commit. We're almost done. This is episode 6 of 7 of this series that is near and dear to my heart because as an American human being, I was just really interested in digging into this topic of why religions right now, why different religions are choosing whether or not to speak up. And I was thinking to myself, there is some phenomenon here that I have to better understand because it seemed clear to me that there were certain religious leaders that felt a moral imperative to speak truth to power around so many issues that are going on in the world and especially in the United States because of the Trump administration. And so, yeah, I went there. I did a big old deep dive, and the outcome of that is this series. And so today, actually, Nathan, before we jump in, would you just share with me or share with everybody what you said to me right before we hit the record button? You said this is kind of bringing it all home. Today's, yeah.
Yeah. This episode is kind of intended to summarize some of our points that really pertain to the original question that we asked when starting the series, which is what is the relationship between spiritual systems and government systems, and why do different spiritual systems respond differently when we see perceived injustices in government systems? Why do some speak out and why do some not? And we're hoping at this point that this particular series will kind of bring together lots of different things, topics and ideas that we've had in the first 5 episodes and sort of tie it up in a little bow for us.
That's right. So last episode, what we talked about is how religion and politics are two social systems that are actually, in fact, negotiating the exact same human issues. We talked about how they both negotiate human dignity and worth, issues of justice and injustice, issues of power and morality, and how power should be used. And we also kind of did a little bit of a fun comparison between two prominent figures right now in the world, in the news, representing two different ideologies. From the political side, Donald Trump, and from the spiritual side, Pope Leo XIV. So jump back to that episode if you want to hear that, because that was just really, really fascinating because it's talking about how both of these leaders have a different ideology around every one of those topics. But what it also proves is that religion and politics are not two different realms.
Right.
They are the same realm addressing values in either similar or different ways. And that's the whole thing, is in this case, it happens to be that Trump represents one end of the spectrum and Leo happens to represent a different end of the spectrum. Sometimes religion and politics can absolutely collaborate and support one another. But also keep in mind that it's important to recognize that Pope Leo is showing up, right? Mm-hmm. So by default, Pope Leo is showing up as a marker that he recognizes that his religion and his role in religion, in world religion, is in fact very relevant in this day and in this moment in time.
Right. So religions are spiritual systems, and government systems in their purest form should be working for the same objective, and that is to enhance the well-being of human life. Yeah. Okay? That's what both systems should be working for. And if a government system is acting outside of that value, if it's making choices that are not increasing the overall good of human life, then religious systems have the responsibility to speak up to the government systems and say, we do not believe that you are upholding the correct values that we, as a spiritual system, are instilling in our people and our followers.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, obviously, religions don't have the right to make laws. Okay. But we talked last time about how spiritual systems and government systems do influence each other. And it does go both ways. Okay. So it does matter that governments operate on ideal value systems, capital T truths, capital G goods. And it does matter that religions speak to governments if we don't think they're acting on capital G good. And so that's kind of what we touched on last time.
Yeah, great way to kick us off, Nathan. So let's jump in here. So our claim is this, that we kind of want to play with the ideas around religion and silence. Okay, so we talked already about religions of legitimacy versus religions of transformation. And by the way, neither of them are neutral. But what does sort of come forward is that religions of legitimacy privilege certain values, and religions of transformation privilege other values. And so when they speak is going to really, really matter. Okay. Neither of them are neutral, and how they speak and when they choose to step forward says a lot. And so, in a moment like right now, if religion in general claims to care about morality, compassion, and human dignity, which I think most religions would claim that they do, in a moment like this one, total silence in the face of a lot of injustices can create several ethical problems. And this is kind of what Nathan and I are sort of contending here right now. So let's just spend a minute talking about what this looks like when you, or if you are a religious system. And we're, of course, not the LDS Church is not the only silent religious system, but of course, it's the one we care the most about. It's formed us. It's our primary spiritual language. And so we want to speak respectfully but candidly about what this could be communicating. First thing I want to mention, or bring up at least, is that sometimes in moments like this, silence can look like complicity. When injustice is happening, sometimes this concept or claiming neutrality is generally benefiting those that are oppressing. Something that I want to quote Desmond Tutu here for a second, because he is somebody who was deeply involved in social justice movements as a Catholic priest. And he says this: if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. In a half dozen ways in the United States and in the world in 2026, there is oppression going on amongst different bodies of people, whether it be people from that are immigrants, people that live in Iran, whether it's women whose names were disclosed through the Epstein files who are victims, or some of the ways that we're trying to sort of sweep under the rug a lot of things that are going on around financial exploitation. There's so much financial exploitation right now in this Iran war. There's so much going on. So back to Tutu, if you are neutral or claim neutrality in situations of injustice, I'm going to start that over. I was murdering that. If this is Desmond Tutu, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor.
Yeah. So, what we're talking about here, there are two points to look at. Okay. Number one is, when churches stay silent, why do they stay silent? Okay. So you hit on this when you started this. Okay. Churches of legitimacy are more concerned about protecting themselves and staying, socially relevant. And so they often back down from a fight. I mean, to put it bluntly, right? They back down for a fight because they're more interested in protecting themselves.
Like, let me ask you about that. Are we, and I know we've been saying that, but now I'm actually having a second thought. Is it protecting themselves? I mean, I think that's partially true, but I actually wonder if it's also about protecting their ideologies, right? In other words, maybe there's the self-protection connected to not wanting to like get in the fray of these controversial issues around immigration and things like that. But I think also in some ways, what am I trying to say? Their ideology demands that they speak courageously in issues that to them are wrong, like LGBTQ issues, but not as motivated in these issues because they're not as loaded theologically for them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So I think that we've talked about both of these issues. Okay. Sometimes churches are more interested in protecting themselves, and that can be internal protection, right? So if the church were to speak out about something that Donald Trump did, they risk actually fracturing a large part of their own membership, right? There might be people within the church who would be offended by speaking out
Fair.
on the Epstein files, and really conservative members of the LDS Church would be like, "Hey, don't speak out against my president." And also they'd be taking on the president, as we've seen. That can also be fraught. So there are different ways of protecting themselves. The second issue that you bring up is that churches sometimes don't have the right ideals, right? And they don't prioritize the right ideals. And so I think that's a second reason. Okay. Now that's the part about why they don't speak up. Now, going back to the question that you were just asking when you started this, is that what does it say when you don't speak up? Well, what it says is I'm more interested in preserving myself, or I don't share that ideal. That's what it says.
Amen.
I'm either afraid of you or I don't believe the same way. So when, for instance, the United States brought same-gender marriage to the Supreme Court, right? The church spoke up and said, we disagree with this. And I believe that the church was on the wrong side of truth in history by bringing the wrong ideals. Okay. Now, I think that the church probably has a softer spot for immigrants. We mentioned this in one of our episodes, right? The United States is full of undocumented immigrants, and yet we let our missionaries go out and teach them vigorously the gospel. Okay. I think that the church probably has the right ideal around undocumented immigrants in the United States, which is love them and bring them in. But I think they are afraid to speak out, not because the ideal is wrong, but because I think they're afraid of either going up against this powerful government system or that many of the members internally will disagree and there'll be a fracture.
That's a super good point, Nathan. We're back to the article of faith number 12, that we are subject to kings. And that seems in this moment to be a higher priority than protecting the immigrant.
Right.
Even the convert, Latter-day Saint immigrant that could be disappeared.
Right.
Or, violently put in a detention center. That is of lesser importance based on the reality that a choice has been made when one chooses silence.
Correct.
That is what is being communicated.
Exactly.
They are on the side of the oppressor.
Right.
And that pains me to say that directly, but this is what feels true. Let's move on to the second point. Okay, so first point around what is being communicated when silence is the response in times of social unrest like right now. The second point that I want to make is that we are putting into question where we are in terms of our leadership as moral authorities. I believe that religion is not productive in 2026 to stand up and be the only, like to stand up on truth claims. In this era of awakening, human beings are just many human beings that are especially more mature, more psychologically, further along in their development. They're not interested so much in truth claims. We're recognizing, I think more so than ever, that humanity, that we're all in this together, that we are a family, and that we may have different practices and rituals and traditions, but that at the core of it all, we're in this together. And so it's not about who's done it right or whose God is right. It's really more about creating community and being a force for good in the world. And so what is being communicated in moments of this nature is that we are not acting with moral authority if we're being silent as religious institutions.
Correct. So again, if we go back to the idea that sometimes we have the wrong values, truth claims are kind of the nail in the coffin, because you don't have the ability to pivot when you have a truth claim on an incorrect value. And I know we've used these examples, but I think they're worth using again. Okay. If you say Joseph Smith was inspired to practice polygamy and he took a 14-year-old wife, it will be very difficult to speak out on a president who had an underage prostitute. Okay. And I know it's not exactly the same, but the point is that if you stand by some of the really ugly truths that happened in polygamy in our early history, it becomes very hard to speak out against the same or similar kinds of actions later. Same thing, we use the example of the civil rights movement. We couldn't speak out as a church during the civil rights movement because we had a truth claim around banning priesthood inclusion of black men. And so, because our truth claim nailed us to having to stand by the priesthood ban, we couldn't participate in the civil rights movement. So, truth claims prevent us from changing incorrect perspectives, therefore, keeping us from speaking out when government systems are oppressive.
And so what I think you're saying, if we were to kind of start tying these things together or continue to tie these things together, is legitimacy-based churches are really, really focused on truth claims that make it challenging to be a moral authority in times like this, in part because they are oftentimes not on the side of transformation. They're more on the sides of maintaining dominator power structures or dominator hierarchies. And so the thing that makes it challenging in moments like this, like Nathan was saying, is that even if a church is hopefully evolving, which often they really actually are, because I do believe churches are organisms that, grow through an arc of development too, when you've pinned your whole identity on truth claims and claim that God himself made this whole thing up, and then you're recognizing that, oh my goodness, maybe we got this wrong, it starts to be very, very awkward to publicly awaken. Now, that's not to say that one shouldn't, because churches do it all the time. They stand up and say, we did this wrong. Now we are in favor of civil rights, of gender equality, of what have you. But it makes it very, very challenging in moments of this nature. And oftentimes what happens is silence. This could be silence of embarrassment that I think they might be right, but I have my own shadow, right? I'm thinking about that with like the Epstein files. I don't think, I could be wrong, but I dare say nobody has explicitly connected Mormon polygamy with the Epstein files and said, this is why I don't speak. I think those kinds of things hover in the subconscious.
In the shadow, that's right.
They hover in the shadow. And, upholding patriarchy, upholding patriarchy, again, that's a shadow issue. It becomes challenging to push up against institutional, hierarchical dominator patriarchies when that's what you are as a church, right? It's ironic in some ways that the Catholic Church also is an institutional patriarchy and yet evolved enough to be on the right side of truth and to be speaking truth to power. What that says to me is that humanity is complicated, that we all contain multitudes, and that while the Catholic Church has, distances to go in gender equality issues and in some other issues, to be sure, they're allowed and standing up to truths, which to me says they are closer to awakening around some of these issues because they are confronting things and have fewer things in the shadow, I think, perhaps by default. And I could be wrong on that. Maybe there are some shadows that are independent of this issue. But at this moment in time, what is being communicated by Pope Leo is that the Catholic Church stands as a moral authority. They're not just saying sort of generically or nebulously, love your neighbor, defend the widow and the orphan, do justice, love mercy, kind of the platitudes of Christianity or Catholicism. They're actually putting their money where their mouth is. All right? They're actually turning these Jesus-oriented teachings into on-the-ground application in real time with real people in real danger.
Right.
Okay, so let's move into one more. Maybe there's two more. Well, actually, this is an extension of the last one. Just to kind of bridge the gap between what we were already talking about is to recognize that religious leaders have often been forces for moral reform, right? So in other words, and you have a church that says, no, we don't, neutrality, we stay out of these things, right? Keep in mind, no one's neutral. You're just choosing your stances. But the way that enlightenment or consciousness awakening happens at a collective level or at the level of civilization is by brave people everywhere speaking up. And if you have a public platform like a church, you are a very important voice to be participating in these very moral reforms. In other words, if you want to move civilization forward, you have more influence as the Pope of the Catholic Church than you do if you're, you or me, Nathan, right? Like you just do. And so the more you speak up, the more power you have, the more influence you have. The abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, anti-apartheid struggles, and like generations of care for the refugees and the poor throughout the world, those movements have been led and fueled by formal religious conviction.
Yep. And again, I think it's a struggle in our LDS system because we spent the time, let's use abolition as an example, okay? At the time when abolitionists were, trying to move slaves out of the South to the safety of the North, and, the United States was preparing to fight a war over this. In Utah, we have Brigham Young, who is upholding the institution of slavery. He has slaves. He accepts slaves as tithing, and he applies for statehood for the state of Utah as a slave state. And so if you are applying for statehood as a slave state, you cannot speak out against slavery. I'm sorry, you can't. And so you are correct in the sense that these churches of transformation were really working out and saying, hey, we're gonna put our necks out there, but this is what we think represents the Christian values or the spiritual values if you're not of the Christian system. And we were always a step behind in a lot of these areas. We were just a step behind.
What it has me thinking about, Nathan, is that churches of legitimacy, tell me how you feel about this, because this just popped into my head. The churches of legitimacy struggle with issues around like institutional reparation or atonement, right? Like, in other words, probably legitimacy churches are very interested in looking to individual repair, individual healing. If you're a church that's interested in like sin and atonement and repentance and things like that, which I have a complicated relationship. That's actually not that complicated anymore. I have a very different relationship than I used to. But be that as it may, if you're a legitimacy church, you are not interested in confronting those very fundamental Christian ideas at the level of the institution. Whereas, check this out. I think I'm onto something here. I think transformation churches probably have just as many skeletons in the closet, but by nature of the fact that they're transformational, they are addressing their own institutional shadows. They are moving into an admission of where they got it wrong, and or perhaps even their stepping into these challenging spaces brings about the maturity that leads to the capacity to look at atonement for themselves as a church. Do you think that's right?
I do. I think there are some examples of churches who have done it wrong, but have admitted that they did some things wrong and were willing to be transformational themselves.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, which I think is lovely, because what it's saying is that nobody's got it right. Like, everyone's on a growth trajectory. It's just that I think those humans in those churches that are transformational in nature have figured out that their worth is not on the line by being messy.
Yeah.
And therefore they're able to step into these challenging spaces because they've already done their own personal work, acknowledging that they aren't perfect, that they've made mistakes, and in some ways, their identity is not on the line anymore. They don't have to prove themselves or be afraid anymore. And then they have more space to actually look after the poor, take care of the needy, look after those on the margins, because they themselves are not feeling motivated by fear and by the need to sort of satisfy an angry God figure. I think their relationship with God, with themselves and others, is different in that mode of transformation than it is in the mode of legitimacy, which gives them more bandwidth to actually take care of or speak up for those in the most pain.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
All right. So one more that I want to just touch into right now. So just back, kind of a little bit of a review. We've been talking about what church's silence says, right? When a church is silent, what are they communicating? First thing we talked about is complicity. Second thing we're talking about it is that they are not really strong in being moral authorities in their societies. And the last thing I want to talk about is something that I've played with a little bit in my growth and processing groups, but I don't know if I've ever mentioned it here on the podcast. I propose that we change the whole idea of prophet, right? I think the idea or the word prophet needs to just go away. I think we should throw it out. But I do kind of like the word prophecy. Okay. And what I mean by that is that when someone is a prophet, boy, what a lot of pressure that puts on them, right? And also the expectation, the ego that could be involved in that. Being a prophet as a noun, as if someone becomes this thing and is this thing always, I think is nothing but trouble. However, what if we just looked at the word prophecy or to prophesy? Then everybody gets to take ownership in that one. Every human being has the potential as a divine spark of God or a piece of divinity in human form. We all have the capacity to prophesy, okay? You're probably wondering, where is she going with this, okay? So this is my thought. Churches, in moments of social unrest right now, have the ability to speak prophetically, as do human beings, as does each of us, right? So if you look at the great church traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, a lot of the great traditions, there is a theme that runs through each and every one of these. And so it's probably part of the perennial tradition, big capital T truth, that leaders are called to speak truth to power. And what they do is generally very unpopular. And oftentimes inside of their own cultures, they are deeply misunderstood. And this, to me, when you think about this, it broadens the idea of who is a prophet. And in my mind, the prophet is the one that has the courage to speak truth to power. And so if I were to extend that definition a little further, look at every individual leading a church or otherwise who is speaking towards love and peace and de-escalation and justice to those who have been harmed. These are the prophets, and there are many of them. And that's why it makes me sad that some of the people that we have been born and raised to call prophets are nowhere to be seen right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, especially if you look at the history in the Hebrew Bible, as at least the way that it's recorded. You have Moses confronting Pharaoh.
Yeah.
You have Nathan confronting David for his adultery and his murder, right? You have Queen Esther confronting Naaman, who wanted to have the Israelites executed. And so you do have this tradition of part of what a prophet did was to go to the political power and say, hell no.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they didn't claim political neutrality when it was inconvenient or unpopular, right? Okay, so what this does not mean as we close is it doesn't necessarily mean that anyone needs to go out there and endorse a political party. Actually, I agree with the LDS Church's stance on that, to not endorse a political party. But what you'll notice is in no uncertain terms has the Pope endorsed a political party. He would stand up against either political party if what was going on now was going on. Like, in other words, it doesn't matter who the party is, okay? And that we're not saying that prophetic leaders should be telling people, how to vote or turning, church worship services into campaign rallies. But we are saying that there is enough of an intersection between the both that we can see that religious systems and those who lead them, who have the integrity and lead churches and live lives of transformation, name cruelty as cruelty. They defend the vulnerable. And they apply these moral teachings in the public realm. They speak up when they see something happening. This is not about being partisan, but what this is about is having integrity and being principled. Because both political and religious systems ought to be about, like you've said this, Nathan, a few times, I love it, how to help human beings thrive and live together, how to help human beings understand the good, the true, and the beautiful, how both of these systems can help people live a meaningful life, and then to create laws that help protect people from harm so that meaningful lives can be unfolded in ways that work well for different people in different cultures. Anything that you want to say as we close this episode today, Nath?
I think we've wrapped it up well.
Okay, so next episode, our closing one, is we're going to just weigh in with Jesus, okay? And when I say Jesus, I mean the Jesus I'm learning to know and love, Jesus of Nazareth, not Jesus, Savior, Lord, and King of the universe, because I've come to realize I think those are two very, very different figures. So more to come on this in our closing episode about how religion is political. Thanks, y'all, for being here. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Right, bye.
Thank you for listening to Latter-day Struggles. If this podcast has supported your faith journey, we invite you to explore the many ways you can continue your healing and growth with us. On our website, you'll find support and processing groups, marriage and parenting courses, and free resources to support where you are in your faith journey. You can also join Valerie in the live fellowship gatherings throughout the year, where we connect, process the podcast, and build meaningful friendships with others on similar paths. If cost has ever been a barrier, we offer podcast scholarships funded by listener donations. To explore all of these offerings, visit the link in today's show notes or go to latterdaystruggles.com. And if this podcast has been meaningful to you, leaving a 5-star review is one of the most powerful ways to help others find this work. Latter-day Struggles is proud to be part of the Dialogue Podcast Network.
Dialogue Podcast Network.